Capitol for 10 years. It's not necessarily the first U.S. Capitol. The Constitution is written next door in Independence Hall in 1787. And that U.S. Constitution calls for a national capital city. But it basically says they don't want that city to be a part of any state. They don't want any state to have like an advantage over the others. And so the problem was, well, where do we find the U.S. government today, guys?
Washington.
D.C. And what is that D.C. standing for? District of Columbia. So it's a federal district, it's not a state. So that's why the government is going to go to a place that is not a state, so that those states don't have an advantage. But the problem is Washington, D.C. doesn't exist. So prior to the Constitution, you have the Continental Congress. And the Continental Congress allowed to meet wherever they want. They were in Independence Hall throughout the Revolutionary War. They declared independence there. When they get to the end of the war, they leave Philadelphia. They're actually in 5 cities in less than 5 years. Philadelphia, Princeton, Annapolis, so Princeton, New Jersey, Annapolis, Maryland, Trenton, New Jersey, and the last stop was, anybody?
New York.
It's the big city today. New York City. Yeah. So New York City is the last meeting place of the old Continental Congress, and it's going to become the first capital of the new United States under our new Constitution, because since Washington, D.C. doesn't exist, since the old government was up in New York, they just said, well, let's just put the new government in New York. So for the next year, the U.S. government's in the building on Wall Street. Now that building is not there anymore, but that's where George Washington became inaugurated as the first president. They spent a lot of time organizing, and they finally passed a law called the Residence Act, which is the law to build Washington, D.C. That law says we're going to go back to Philadelphia for 10 years while we're building. Why Philadelphia? Well, number one, we're born in the middle. But number two, Philadelphia was actually the biggest city in the United States in those days. So it just kind of makes sense that Philadelphia would be the capital. Philadelphia hoped they'd be the capital forever. So they had a brand new courthouse. That's what this building was. They gave it to the U.S. government, rent-free, keep it as long as you want, and they turned this building into the U.S. Capitol. So, let me ask you guys. If we're looking at the U.S. Capitol, who would be sitting in that building today or back here? Who? No, he doesn't go to the Capitol. Remember we got checks and balances and separation of powers? Congress, right. And who makes up our Congress?
Senate.
House of
Representative.
Senate's one, House of Representatives, right. House of Representatives the other one. So the difference is the House of Representatives represents us, the people. Each person today down in Washington represents about 700,000 of us. Here in Philadelphia, each one of these guys, because this was the House of Representatives, represented 30,000 people. There were only like 3 million people in the entire United States in those days. So there was only 106 guys in this room. Today, it's 435 down in Washington. So that's the House of Representatives. The Senate represents the states. 2 senators from every one of those states. So originally, 26 senators, eventually 32 senators. Because with our new Constitution, we can start to grow. We can start to add states. Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee are the first 3 new states to the original 13. So when you go upstairs, you're going to see 32 senators. And you're going to see the Senate is a lot nicer than the House of Representatives, which I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get upstairs. But it's a little bit different. And there are reasons for that, which, like I said, we'll get into. Now, otherwise, the government pretty much does what it does today. They pretty much work the same, except for one thing. When they first sit down in this room, one thing that we do not have are political parties. There weren't any political parties when we first started. So the person in the front of the room is called the Speaker of the House. Now today, the Speaker of the House is Paul Ryan. He is one of the most powerful guys in Washington because he is the head of his political party in the House of Representatives. He's got a lot of influence. Here in this room, not really. It's not the same. The first Speaker of the House is a guy named Frederick Muhlenberg. And really, don't feel bad if you don't know who Frederick Muhlenberg is, because he's not one of our famous names from this time period. There's guys like James Madison sitting in this room, but they don't want to be Speaker of the House because all you're doing is running the meetings. You don't have, you can't, it's hard to make laws and get into debates with things because you're busy running the meetings and setting up the agenda for every day. Now that changes when we start to see political parties. And we do start to see political parties pretty quickly. And it's pretty obvious why. And that's because we get arguments about things. They argued about money. What did we argue about this week? Money. They're working on budget stuff. Well, these guys had the same problem. They had debt from the Revolutionary War that we had as a nation. They had to find a way to deal with it. They had to spend money. We have to spend money today, whether it's on the military, or national defense, or roads, whatever it may be. These guys had to figure out how to build Washington, D.C., which is expensive, building a whole city. They had to figure out how to remake our military. Once the Revolutionary War went away, we didn't really have one. We had zero Navy. And before George Washington became president, we had less than 100 men in the entire United States Army. You can imagine less than 100 men. But our neighbor to the north, in other words, Canada, was still British. That was a British colony. And our biggest enemy in the world was England, was Britain. So we figured, well, we need to be able to defend ourselves a bit. So we better start building some forts. You go down to Baltimore, Maryland today, you see park rangers at a fort called Fort McHenry. That's where our Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem, was written. That fort is one of the ones that Congress creates, a small navy. You go up to Boston today. USS Constitution is our oldest warship. That's one of 6 warships that they decided to build to remake a small American navy. So these things are really expensive, so they had to find a way to get money. And how does the government get money? Taxes, right. So they had to start passing tax laws or tariffs on goods coming into the country, which we're talking about doing for imports again. So, and these things, again, we've been arguing about them for a couple hundred years, and that starts to divide us into these political parties. So back then, it was 2 different parties. One is called the Federalists, which is the party of men like Alexander Hamilton or John Adams. The other ones are the Democratic Republicans, which are Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. And of course, once those parties start to come around, they hate each other, just like the parties today. The news, back then it was newspapers for the media. The newspapers would be really nasty back and forth, so it kind of got to what we might recognize as pretty normal politics pretty quickly. Now, I do want to talk about a couple other big things before we take a walk upstairs. Number one is the Bill of Rights. Now, when they wrote our Constitution, there was no Bill of Rights. But a lot of people felt like we should have a list of rights for the people that are going to be protected. So that's something that they started to work on almost right away. In fact, James Madison in the House of Representatives started working on amendments. So the Constitution gives us this ability to make amendments, in other words, changes. But we've never done it before, because that's the thing. We're using this whole thing, everything is new. Everything we're doing, we're kind of inventing it. We're doing it for the first time, whether it's making American money or amendments to the Constitution. So they go through Congress, and those amendments get sent out to the states. You need 3/4 of the states to approve them. Eventually, it was 11 states had to vote for these amendments. Thomas Jefferson was our first Secretary of State. He's the guy who kept track of the voting. And when he got enough states, he was literally able to walk into this building and announce to the Congress we had changed our Constitution. So now you think today about the Bill of Rights. This is something that we talk about all the time. It's something that's a big part of who we are. And it's something that we're going to talk about as long as we're here. But the other thing about it is it proves that we can change the Constitution. Because they're not sure. Until we do it in the real world, is it a bad thing? If we have to turn over and start it over again, we change? We don't know. But then you start thinking of the future of the United States and think of like the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment is the one that outlaws slavery in the United States, or the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote here in the United States. So important steps that we've been able to take. Starting here, that ability to change things, and that's really an important part of who we are. And last thing, in March of 1792, 1797, John Adams stood up here to become the second president of the United States. Now, why would I think that's an important event? Well, our first president, of course, is George Washington. Everybody liked George Washington. When he ran for president, he didn't even run. He didn't even go out and campaign like we used to. People just voted for him. And literally everybody voted for George Washington. He was unanimously elected, the only man to get all the votes. After one term, after 4 years, he announced he was going to retire. People from both sides talked him into another 4 years. You can imagine one guy getting support from both parties. He didn't run. Everybody voted for him again. Second 4 years goes by. He announces he's going to retire. He just wants to go back to his farm. People try to talk him into a third term. This time he says, no, I really just want to retire at this point. So now, for the first time, back in the year 1796, we have an election with two men from two political parties, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Now, if you know their story, you know that they wrote the Declaration of Independence together right next door. They were friends. They even traveled in Europe together. They don't like each other. They don't even talk to each other. For 15 years, they're on opposite sides. They don't even want to see each other. Now, once they both retire, they can't remember why they're mad. They actually do become great friends again. But here in Philadelphia, yeah, they don't want to have anything to do with each other. So the election is really mean and really nasty and really close, and eventually John Adams wins by 3 electoral votes. Now, for us today, watching elections, close elections, nasty elections, sadly, it's kind of normal. But that's the first time that we've ever done this. It's the first time we're going to change presidents. And if you think about it, it's a test of our system where we vote for our leaders and we peacefully go from one to the next. That kind of thing doesn't happen a lot in the world in those days. So basically, it's a big deal to find out if this all works. So John Adams standing up here, becoming our second president, we're not really sure. People are a little worried that the whole thing might fall apart without George Washington in charge. But obviously it works. We're still here today, 200 plus years later. So that's a pretty big deal for us. But I'll leave you with one other problem. When John Adams was standing here, standing next to him was Thomas Jefferson. Because in those days, if you come in second, you actually become the vice president. So that means a president from one side and a vice president from the other side. And if you can imagine the last election, if we still did that, you would have had President Trump and Vice President Clinton together at the Capitol building in January. You can see nobody would like that very much.
Yeah.
These guys didn't like standing together up here. Adams and Jefferson, they didn't like the idea of working together for the next 4 years. So we had to change that vice president thing. Talked about amendments. That's the 12th Amendment. Fixes that problem. So, a few things we had to work on in those early days, but most of it really worked well. Now, that all having been said, we do have the Senate chamber upstairs. When we get upstairs, I want to talk about a couple things. Number one is furniture, because obviously we're letting you guys sit up here or down here. This is not original furniture, but upstairs you can be standing because we do have some original furniture. And then I want to talk a little bit about why the Senate is so much nicer than the House of Representatives. So, if you don't mind those steps, and if you have time to come upstairs, we definitely encourage you. It's worth the trip to see the Senate. We'll go right through the front here. Please watch your step. You can use either staircase on the way up. Please take